Tonight on KPBS Evening Edition, asylum-seekers protest in Tijuana. They say they're fed up with the Mexican government and they're accusing them of accepting bribes. Plus, Vice President Mike Pence plans to visit San Diego with a focus on the border.
With the eventual loss of the bee population, what you would see is more desert than you would see healthy, vibrant landscapes. Their critical impact is on the food source.
Bee research cut. The Trump administration ends government tracking of the declining honeybee population.
It's really an opportunity for us to defy stereotypes and let veterans present themselves as they want to be seen, rather than just being talked about, which sucks.
And incoming. Sex, Drugs, and Copenhagen, the new collection of military stories written by veterans. KPBS Evening Edition starts right now. Good evening. It's Tuesday, July 9th. Thanks for joining us. I'm Ebony Monet. New numbers from the Department of Homeland Security show a drop in illegal border crossings. The latest report shows just over 100,000 encounters in June. The Trump administration says that includes arrests between ports of entry and people deemed inadmissible by customs. It's a 28% drop from May. Asylum seekers from Cameroon and other African countries stage a protest in Tijuana this morning. KPBS reporter Max Rivlin-Nadler says they blocked government vehicles for hours to protest what they believe is a corrupt immigration system.
For months, the demographics of asylum seekers waiting to enter the U.S. in Tijuana has shifted. Caravans of Central Americans has given way to thousands of people from countries like Cameroon and Eritrea who are fleeing political persecution. But for the last few weeks, the amount of people being admitted into the U.S. in coordination with Mexican immigration authorities has slowed to a trickle. For 6 days straight, no one was called from the unofficial list of migrants waiting to hear from Mexican authorities. The Cameroonians believe it's because the asylum processing slots made available by the U.S. each day are now being filled by people bribing Mexican officials. After a protest last Thursday, the asylum seekers announced that if no one was admitted on Tuesday, they would block the vans that take asylum seekers to be processed in the U.S. Shortly after 8 a.m., they followed through on that promise and blocked the driveway next to the port of entry. The African asylum seekers sat on the ground and refused to move.
My money is finished. The immigration, the policy here is very bad.
Members of the brand new Mexican National Guard were called to the protest, but no arrests were made of protesters. Instead, flustered Mexican immigration officials took 8 asylum seekers into the port of entry, where they met for an hour to discuss the protesters' demands. Douglas, who only gave his first name, was one of the negotiators. He said that Mexico promised to allow African asylum seekers to verify that the list was being called in order every day.
So we have told them, they say we will appoint some few people to work with them to see that all corruption is stamped out.
The protesters dispersed a little before 11 a.m. and let the immigration vans proceed, but not without a promise by many of the protesters to hold the Mexicans to their word. Max Rivlin-Nadler, KPBS News.
Meanwhile, the policy that requires U.S. asylum seekers to wait in Mexico is expanding. Nuevo Laredo, a border city near Laredo, Texas, is now the 4th location for the Remain in Mexico policy. That's where 10 migrants crossed the border to seek asylum on Monday. They were sent back today. Nuevo Laredo is included in a U.S. State Department traveling warning due to violent crime. Vice President Mike Pence is coming to San Diego. The vice president will arrive tomorrow night and stay through Thursday. His visit will include a campaign fundraiser. He'll also meet with Navy officials in Coronado. This will be Pence's first visit to San Diego as vice president. He traveled to Calexico last year to view a border wall replacement project. San Diego County will take a closer look at opening new voting centers for the 2020 election. KPBS reporter John Carroll tells us how the process is moving forward.
The idea of creating voting centers to replace polling stations is not new. 5 counties in California have already done it. Today, San Diego County supervisors took up the matter. 4 out of 5 supervisors voted to do a feasibility study on the matter. The proposal comes from Supervisor Nathan Fletcher. He says it would establish several vote centers around the county. If the proposal is ultimately approved, the vote centers would function alongside the county's 1,600 polling places for the 2020 election and would replace the polling stations for the election in 2022. Think of the election centers as mini versions of the registrar's office, where a whole host of services are available. Fletcher says at the heart of his proposal is simply making it easier for people to vote.
A vote center could be open for a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks before the election, and folks from any part of the county could go to any vote center. They could register to vote, they could get help with translation services, or they could cast a ballot. And so it really is just making it easier to participate in democracy and in our elections.
Fletcher says other counties have experienced an increase in voter turnout and some minor cost saving with the elimination of all those polling places. More than 70% of San Diego County residents vote by mail. The feasibility study is scheduled to be complete in 4 months. It will then go back before the supervisors for a vote. John Carroll, KPBS News.
A UC San Diego eye doctor has resigned after KPBS partner iNewsSource raised questions about his ties to China. KPBS's Mark Sauer talked with iNewsSource investigative reporter Brad Racino about how this international issue is playing out in San Diego.
Brad, Dr. Zhang was the subject of an earlier investigative report by iNewsSource. Remind us of that.
So we had started looking into him several months ago because we had been doing a series on risky research and human subject research in the U.S. And what we had found was that he had a history of noncompliance when it came to doing testing on human subjects. Out of that research and out of those stories, we found this news story about his affiliation with 1,000 Talents.
And you were able to discover the doctor's background with the 1,000 Talents and the company set up in China. Why wasn't UC San Diego able to find that out if you were?
That's a great question. One of the experts I actually asked that question to said, well, maybe they don't speak Mandarin. And we honestly don't know what goes on in their compliance offices at UCSD. They haven't been very open about this investigation because it is an ongoing investigation on their part. So they're not telling us what's going on. But we would assume that this wasn't that easy to find. It did take a lot of translation and a lot of Google searching, a lot of patent searching, so maybe it just was that they weren't looking too hard or they didn't know at all.
And you don't speak Mandarin either.
I do not.
Now, in light of this concern by U.S. authorities about foreign scientists, UC San Diego tightening up the vetting process there?
So again, we don't know exactly what they're doing. We did hear something this morning that just came across our desk that they are now transitioning to a digital content management system when it comes to conflict of interest statements. So what we had found was that Dr. Zhang had never filed a conflict of interest disclosure with the Shiley Eye Institute where he worked. And if he had, maybe some of these things would have come forward if he had documented them, but he had not. So now they're at least improving that system.
So that might have been okay with them if he'd come forward, and would that have been within their ethics guidelines?
It might have been. They need to have a conversation about it because they don't want their researchers or scientists spending an exorbitant amount of time and resources overseas or working on their own private businesses. They are primarily an employee of UCSD, but that conversation needs to be had and needs to be disclosed to have that conversation.
All right, now you say iNewsSource was not able to discover evidence that the doctor was illegally sharing intellectual property with China, but wasn't that the goal of China's 1,000 Talents program?
Depends who you ask. So the Chinese government says the point of this program is really to incentivize scientists to come back to China. If you ask the FBI and federal authorities, they say it is to steal intellectual property. So it really depends, and again, we don't have any evidence that he has done this. Okay.
Now, the doctor has an attorney. What's the lawyer say in his defense? You weren't able to talk to the doctor himself.
Right. So the attorney told us that Dr. Zhang's affiliation with 1,000 Talents was not a problem, that it didn't need to be disclosed. There's no problem with it at all. He says no intellectual property was shared with China. He said as far as his businesses are concerned, that maybe Dr. Zhang would have done things differently going forward if he had known the disclosure requirements, but that was not the case.
Okay, and between the allegations of unethical research practices and now undisclosed ties to the Chinese government, what kind of legal jeopardy is the doctor in?
We don't really know. We're not attorneys, but we do know he resigned very recently. across the country, the different scientists at different facilities that have been associated with this 1,000 Talents program that have been scrutinized by their own universities or the National Institutes of Health have resigned. They have been fired. A couple have been arrested for sharing intellectual property or alleged to have shared intellectual property. So we don't know what's going to happen on that end. I would like to point out, though, that UC San Diego is also on the hook here. They are the recipients of NIH funding. Dr. Zhang received more than $15 million in NIH funding, but really the university is the pass-through for that, and they're responsible, according to federal regulations. They should have been collecting these disclosures, and they should have known.
All right. Thanks very much, Brad.
Thank you, Mark.
iNews Source is an independently funded nonprofit partner of KPBS. More money is coming to San Diego to help reduce noise from the airport. San Diego International Airport is getting $4.5 million from the federal government. It's one of 10 grants awarded today to airports in California. The money will be spent on projects to reduce noise that impacts neighborhoods near the airport. When it comes to honeybees, the Trump administration is tightening its budget. CNN reporter Suzanne Malveaux tells us about a decision to cut research on dropping bee populations.
Bee populations already on the decline, now facing an added blow as the U.S. Department of Agriculture suspends collecting data for its annual honeybee colonies report, a critical tool for understanding the plummeting honeybee population.
With the eventual loss of the bee population, what you would see is more desert than you would see healthy, vibrant landscapes. Their critical impact is on the food source.
It's estimated that 1/3 of the U.S.'s food supply depends on the bee because they help pollinate many crops we eat, including apples, avocados, almonds, and grapes. Bee populations have been steadily declining since 2006. Colonies facing threats from parasites, pesticides, habitat loss, and climate change. In 2014, the Obama administration launched a program to address the plummeting honeybee population, directing federal agencies to track the problem and work on preserving bee colonies, as well as other critical pollinators, including butterflies. The Trump administration, through the U.S. Department of Agriculture, now undoing those efforts. Last year, reversing an Obama-era rule, barring the use of a chemical that is known to contribute to the decline of bee colonies. The EPA has also granted emergency permission to 18 states, under certain circumstances, to spray an insecticide considered highly toxic to bees.
We will defend the environment, but we will also defend American sovereignty, American prosperity, and we will defend American jobs.
A survey which tracked how farmers pay for honeybees to pollinate their crops was suspended in 2018, and another survey on honey production was scaled back. Now, a third bee-related database aimed at tracking how many bees are being lost is being suspended.
Keeping this statistical study going is very important so that we understand what's going on and you can make the resources available to try to solve the problem. You need to have data. You need to have a database that says, in fact, our bees are thriving, or in fact, our bees are not thriving.
Just part of the Trump administration's rollout of its own environmental plan.
My administration is now revising the past administration's misguided regulations to better protect the environment and to protect our American workers.
The USDA said the critical data collection suspension was temporary, stating the decision to suspend data collection was not made lightly, but was necessary given available fiscal and program resources.
We created the first ever White House beehive, and hopefully our bees are asleep right now.
Saving the bees has typically been a bipartisan effort. Former First Lady Michelle Obama and current Second Lady Karen Pence both taking up the cause.
One of the reasons that we wanted to bring a beehive to the Vice President's residence was because we wanted to help our bee population. It was important to us to do what we could. A lot of our crops are highly dependent on bees to pollinate.
The San Diego Union Tribune reports an increase in the bee population, but beekeepers say that's due to all the rain we saw last winter. More intense cycles of rain and drought. That's what San Diego researchers say is likely. KPBS environment reporter Eric Anderson says it's connected to the warming sea and atmosphere.
Scripps Institution of Oceanography researchers are among a team of scientists that expect atmospheric rivers to have a growing impact on Southern California. The weather systems bring moisture from growing subtropics to San Diego while blocking colder storms from the north. Research meteorologist Alexander Gershinoff says drier periods will last longer, but when it rains, the downpours will be more intense. He says this past winter showed how things are already shifting.
We had a sequence of warm and cold events, cold storms with snow levels down to 2,500 feet, and then a few days later, warm storm, an atmospheric river with snow levels up to 9,000 feet with rain on top of the snow, and basically then you get more water coming down the mountain than what comes out of the sky because it also melts the snow.
Korshunov says atmospheric rivers will bring wetter and more intense storms to the region. He says overall rainfall averages should stay about where they are. The findings are published in the journal Nature Scientific Reports. Eric Anderson, KPBS News.
Well, there's no sign of rain here in San Diego. Instead, more summer heat is expected this week. Erin Calandra has our forecast.
Well, I hope you enjoyed your day today. The weather is looking great. Take a look at the satellite, the radar. Not much going on here. We are seeing some pretty sunny skies, and that's really the case for much of California. Far off to the north, they're seeing a couple of showers moving in off the Pacific, but really everyone here in SoCal, well, we are seeing nothing but beautiful conditions. Tonight, 64 for the low temperature in the metro. You'll notice those clouds building throughout the night. It'll still be cloudy in the morning, and then we'll see that afternoon sunshine as we typically do. Oceanside, 62 for the low, Ramona, 53. Chula Vista, 63 for the low temperature. And in Borrego Springs, we'll see a low of 73 degrees. Tomorrow, well, we're going to be really comfortable here right along the coast. San Diego, feeling good. But once you get into those interior areas, into the deserts, that's where those temperatures are soaring. It is hot, so make sure if you're in that area that you're drinking water. Try to stay cool. Oceanside, a perfect 76 degrees. San Diego at 74 for the high. Very average for this time of year. Once you get into Ramona, it's getting warmer, up to 89 degrees. But check out Borrego Springs, 109. Nothing new. If you live in Borrego Springs, you're used to that. Now, here is our outlook for late week, and we're staying high and dry. The jet stream far off to the north of us, and the 5-day for the coast looks great. We go from those mid-70s. It warms up above average, reaching the 80s by the weekend with sunshine. Inland, we'll see temperatures peaking at 92 degrees Saturday. That will be the hottest day of the week, so try to find something cool to do. And in the deserts, we are cruising through those 100s. The hottest day of the week, well, that's Friday at 112 degrees. It's going to be dangerously hot, so make sure you are staying cool. Check on the elderly neighbors, the kiddos, and the pets. In the mountains, well, that's the retreat. If you're hot, head there. We're going to be in the 70s on Wednesday. The rest of the week, though, pretty comfortable. Sunshine with our temperatures in the 80s. For KPBS News, I'm Erin Calandra.
What if your gut served as a passport of sorts, where the bacteria in our systems could indicate where we've last traveled? KPBS science and technology reporter Shalina Chatlani spoke to researchers here in San Diego who've asked that very question.
From the labs of San Diego State University, biologist Rob Edwards has been leading a team of over 100 scientists around the world. He's asked each of them to collect samples of sewage water. That's because they can provide a window into our microbiomes.
So you've heard about the human microbiome. That's the collection of all of the bacteria and viruses that are associated with our body.
By using a computer to see the DNA sequences of these samples, Edwards and his team discovered a virus they call crossphage. What they found is that this virus infects bacteria everywhere. It was ubiquitous in every country and city they looked at. Edwards says this virus is non-threatening and has been in our systems and environments for numerous generations. But that's not all they discovered.
So when we look at the sequences, we find very unique signatures for each country. So if we take the sequence of the virus from the United States, it looks like other viruses from the United States. If we travel across to Europe and identify the viruses, say from France, they look like the viruses from France.
Edwards says this study could help researchers create drugs or medicinal therapies that are more targeted, perhaps based on geographic location or environment. And Dr. Jack Gilbert agrees. He's the director of the Microbiome Center at UC San Diego, where researchers are studying bacteria.
We are just another ecosystem. And by mapping out how all the different viruses in our body evolve alongside us, we will develop strategic ways to intervene in our health and therefore be able to live healthier, more productive lives.
Though Gilbert says more work has to be done before we get to this point.
This is a single investigation of a diverse population of a single phage type which exists in our bodies.
So he says there have to be more investigations because there are lots of bacteria and lots of viruses in our systems. But he says the study is a very promising start.
The crass phage appears to correlate very well with the abundance of a certain very abundant type of bacteria. So now we might have the host. We might have the target that virus is attacking inside our bodies.
And back at San Diego State University, researcher Rob Edwards says he plans on investigating why this virus is different in various parts of the world. Shalina Chatlani, KPBS News.
I'm Judy Woodruff. Tonight on the NewsHour, how charges against hedge fund manager Jeffrey Epstein shine light on the scope of sex trafficking of underage girls. Coming up at 7 after Evening Edition on KPBS.
San Diego is known for its military presence, and now the city is formally opposing President Trump's decision to limit service by transgender people. This afternoon, the city council voted to approve the symbolic resolution. President Trump announced the policy 2 years ago, but it did not take effect until April. It reverses President Obama's 2016 policy that allowed transgender people to serve openly. You can find from the creators of Incoming, a platform that gives veterans an opportunity to tell their stories through live performances, publications, a podcast, and a radio show you can hear on KPBS, comes a new anthology, Sex, Drugs, and Copenhagen, a first-hand look at military life. Joining us now is Justin Hudnall, the executive director of So Say We All. Welcome.
Thanks for having me.
So how does Sex, Drugs, and Copenhagen differ from other stories about veterans?
So our first anthology focused on the experience of veterans coming home and transitioning back into civilian life. And we wanted to make our second book something that no one had ever read in the world of veteran literature before. Veterans are so often portrayed in media as either victims, villains, or heroes, none of which really exist in real life as like full-bodied characters. So we wanted to do a collection that was all about the dark and weird and funny and shocking moments that come from waiting, and waiting really makes up so much of a service person's career that it would be remiss not to point it out. So Sex, Drugs, and Copenhagen, the chewing tobacco, not the place in Europe, is what we went for because everybody picks up bad habits of one kind or another to get through it.
And when you talk about waiting, that's something that you don't really hear a lot of discussion about. Why is that such a big part of military life?
Because the military is part of the government, and the government's not known for efficiency in all things. And when you step outside of Hollywood, there is a lot of standing around, waiting for orders, waiting for people to figure out what's going on, waiting to figure out if you're going to go to war.
You mentioned that veterans could find the humor in their experience. Do you think that telling your story or writing your story helps with that?
Oh, absolutely. I think that humor is really the spoonful of sugar that makes the medicine go down with a lot of dark subject matter. And contrary to maybe the perception, I think veterans are some of the funniest people I know and get to work with because it's such a necessity to be able to laugh in the face of fear and uncertainty, danger, and it's the darkest humor I know, but it's also, I think, the most necessary kind of humor. And I think that sometimes that can come off as a little shocking or off-putting, but I definitely think it's the most honest. And so humor and veteran literature really do go hand in hand.
And So Say We All gives veterans an opportunity to share their stories with live performances, books, also the radio show and the podcast. What's the ultimate goal of giving veterans a platform to tell their stories?
I think it's twofold. One, I think civilians really have a yearning to understand who their military is. So few of us actually ever serve, and within even that tiny body, so few ever actually see combat. And yet it makes up such a huge part of American diplomacy, for lack of a better word, that I think we really do need to use the cliche, bridge that gap a little bit better. And I hope that this series helps us do that. And on the other hand, I also think that veterans deserve to be heard as fully formed people and as artists, full stop, who also happen to be veterans. And so this is an opportunity to really show a side that the stereotypes, this is really an opportunity for us to defy stereotypes and let veterans present themselves as they want to be seen, rather than just being talked about, which sucks.
What's the experience like reading this anthology?
I think the experience is going to be really one of surprise primarily. There has been no forum to let veterans talk about this subject matter, to really let them focus on the funny and surreal and absurd aspects of their career. And I hope that it really invites more curiosity about just what actually goes on in a service person's career and what is really entailed when you join the military that the recruiter doesn't tell you about.
And where can people find the book?
You can find this book on Amazon, and you can find it in San Diego's best independent bookstore, Verbatim Books.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
You can find tonight's stories on our website, kpbs.org/evening edition. Thanks for joining us. Have a great night.